Okay, guys, well, this video is actually really just for slides 9 and 10, but I want to say something about slide 8 because I forgot to mention on the last video, forgot to mention that slide 8 was also involved in that video, and it just went over my head that a lot of what I said in that prior video expanded on the second half, the non-psychopathological side of internet addiction. And on slide 8, I kind of listed the various things that comprise the theory that I was talking about. So slide 8, I don't need to say anything about it again. It's in my video for slide 7, but that's what slide 8 is. Sorry about that. I just didn't realize it. And getting ready to do slide 9 and 10, I went, oh, crap, shit. I actually said shit. I forgot to put it in the other video. So just that, keep that in mind. That's what slide 8 is about. We're going to move on to slides 9 and 10. Now, slides 9 and 10 are about addictive approach criteria. So talked a little bit about the criteria for internet gaming disorder in a prior video, but I want to talk about sort of the more general proposed criteria for internet addiction. And you can see as we go through this, food addiction, sex addiction, exercise addiction, internet addiction, gaming addiction, whatever, there's this attempt to try desperately to align the accepted substance use and alcohol addiction criteria that are in the DSM-5 with all these other forms of so-called, quote, behavioral rather than pharmacologic addiction. So on slide number 9, a behavioral addiction, just to remind you, because we talked about this with exercise addiction, a behavioral addiction similar to a substance use disorder that results from similar kinds of biopsychosocial processes, right? So some researchers who want to call internet overuse an addiction or something that can become a, quote, bona fide addiction are saying, hey, look, we even have some neuroimaging studies, meaning you know what that means, right? Functional MRIs, PET scans, typically. And you guys know so much about these already. I don't need to say what they are again, but you know what they do, you know how they work, and you know what they tell us and don't tell us. They say, hey, results from neuroimaging studies using fMRI and PET scan show us neurobiological changes in the brain for people who are compulsively using the internet that look very similar to those we see in substance and alcohol addiction, such as lower activation in detecting conflicts, which would indicate that the prefrontal cortex, the judgment center, the frontal lobe, the judgment center, rational thinking center, reflective center is not working as well. Less efficiency in information processing in general, lower cognitive control, impaired executive control, enhanced reward sensitivity. I started to say this in a prior video, right? They're indicating that the research suggests, just like in substance and alcohol addiction, the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex activation gets lower, that stop system, that reflective system, that judgment system, and the go, 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 go center that seeks pleasure and reward, the amygdala, the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, the limbic system gets more activated. They're saying, look, we're seeing similar things, similar asymmetries in the functionality of the stop and go systems and the areas of the brain involved in them when people become compulsively involved in use of the internet. They also suggest, the folks who take the addictive approach to internet overuse, that addiction is suggested by the presence of symptoms in individuals with internet overuse that are very similar to what we see in substance and alcohol addiction, both biologically and behaviorally. Okay, and 4 of these in particular, researchers suggest as most critical in this regard, in thinking about internet overuse as addictive, just like substances and alcohol. Number 1, the excessive use, which is often associated with loss of a sense of time or neglect of basic needs and drive. So they're saying, look, there are people who will be so embroiled and compulsively using the internet, they'll be on it for 15 hours at a time and not even eat, okay, which is a basic hunger drive, or not sleep, which we need to survive. And they also won't take care of their other necessities of life, and they don't even realize 15 hours has gone by. Next, again, we get into the withdrawal intolerance, which I've talked about so much. I'm not even going to say what it is again because you know what they are. What kind of withdrawal symptoms here? Anger, tension, depression, if people cannot get on their computer and access the internet or use their smartphone and get on the internet. Tolerance, meaning people need to have more computer equipment, better computer equipment, more software, more hours of use in order to get the same feeling that they were getting out of using the internet in the first place. Negative repercussions, just like people with alcohol and substance abuse have negative repercussions. Here we're talking about with internet addiction, getting into arguments with friends and family and loved ones, lying, not achieving as much as they would otherwise, isolating themselves socially, sleeping, not sleeping more, feeling exhausted more, feeling fatigued more, right? And all because of excessive use of the internet. So what would this look like? Arguing with a significant other because they never spend time with you because you're on the internet constantly. Lying to people and saying you got things done that you didn't get done because you were on the internet for 15 hours. Not doing as well in school because you didn't study or get your work done because you're on the internet for 15 hours, right? Isolating yourself and sitting on your computer for 20 hours at a time instead of actually going out and seeing friends, etc., etc. And finally, one of the things that researchers have pointed out is that the diagnostic criteria for impulse control disorders do overlap with addictive disorders. So remember I said in the prior set of videos that there's this idea that perhaps we should look at internet addiction as really a form of existing disorder categories, one of which was impulse control disorders, the other of which was addictive disorders. If you actually go into the DSM, I encourage you to do it. You can look online and find it easily. Look at the criteria for impulse control disorders. Look at the criteria for internet addiction, and you will see there is overlap. And so some researchers have said internet addiction, as it's being called, is probably a combination of both of these disorders, actually, and conceptualized as a combination of both of these disorders. Okay, so let's move on to slide number 10. In 2010, researchers by the name of Dow et al. Expanded the criteria for internet addiction beyond what I just said on slide 9. So let's take a look at this. Now, it is always good if you use data. I'm the person in every meeting who goes, excuse me, what does the data show? Excuse me, is that based on research? Because the truth of the matter is, often what we think, right, and our own experiences even may not actually be indicative of what most people experience. And so data-based decision-making is a good idea. And boy, is that necessary to think about in our current COVID circumstances when it comes to should we open things up again? How should we do it? How soon, etc. But I digress. Let's get back to internet addiction. So in 2010, Dow and colleagues, based on their clinical experiences and clinical experiences with just about 400 participants, they expanded the criteria for addictive disorder to, for internet addiction in particular, to something a little bit more complete and more inclusive. Their diagnostic definition of internet addiction emphasizes the obligatory presence of two symptoms in particular. And so by obligatory, meaning these have to be present to consider this a form of internet addiction per se. Preoccupation with the internet when the person is offline. Withdrawal, which is manifested by dysphoric mood, anxiety, irritability, or boredom after being offline for for several days, right? So preoccupation, again, you can see the alignment with substance and alcohol use disorders. When you're not using, you're thinking about using, and when am I next using, and how am I getting my drug of choice? Same thing here. When the person's not using the internet, they're thinking, oh, I want to get back on Instagram. I want to post stuff. I want to check email. And if they don't do it, they feel sad, they feel anxious, they feel stressed, they feel irritable, or just bored if they can't go online. Now, in addition to those two obligatory, according to Dow et al., with the sample they worked with of people they considered to be addicted, Additionally, one or more of the following 5 symptoms, they argue, should also be present to call this an addiction in particular. Tolerance, and again, I've talked about this to death, defined as increased internet use required to achieve the same level of satisfaction as before. Persistent desire and or unsuccessful attempts to control, cut back, or discontinue internet use. Continued excessive use of the internet despite physical or psychological problems likely to have been caused or worsened by internet use. What would physical look like? Things even as much as you have tension and your back hurts because you're constantly on the computer for hours and hours and hours at a time. That could be one example. Or carpal tunnel because you're on the computer for 20 hours a day because of internet use. Next of the 5, one of which could be present, is they argued loss of previous interests, hobbies, or other pleasurable pursuits. Like people aren't doing anything else they used to do anymore for fun because they're constantly on the internet. And finally, use of the internet to escape or relieve a dysphoric mood. So people who are using the internet repeatedly to escape depression, to escape anxiety, anger, etc. Finally, combining the symptom criteria with 3 additional criteria, Dow et al. Argued, based on their sample of approximately 400 people, increased diagnostic accuracy to almost 100%, 99.26%, with 89.66% specificity and 100% reliability, without getting too complicated. These are ways of determining whether or not, statistically speaking, you are creating diagnostic criteria that reveal what we call true positives instead of false positives. True positives mean I say you have this disorder and you really have this disorder. False positive is I say you have this disorder, but you really don't have this disorder. These criteria, specificity and reliability, are important in any form of diagnosis, medically or otherwise. And we want tests that have high levels of specificity and reliability. Otherwise, we run the risk of 2 things. We run the risk of false positives and false negatives, which means false positives, we run the risk, if we have the wrong criteria, of saying people have an illness they don't really have. False negatives, if we have the wrong criteria, we run the risk of missing categorizing people who really need help, who really do have the illness, but we say they don't. Okay, so I don't want to get too complicated beyond that, but just know that these researchers, Dow et al., suggested, along with the criteria I mentioned to you so far, that they have expanded. Also, if we really want to limit false positives and false negatives and get true positives, call the people who have it, who really have it, we call the people internet addicts who deserve to be categorized that way. Then we need to add these 3 additional criteria. Excessive internet use is not better accounted for by another disorder. That's where things get complicated. So is it OCD really and not internet use? And the internet use is a form of OCD, for example. Excessive internet use results in functional impairment, such as academically, professionally, or in personal relationships, meaning the excessive use of the internet is creating dysfunction in one's daily life roles. And 3, duration of heavy internet use exceeds 3 months with at least 6 hours of internet use that is not caused by academic or work-related requirements. Like, I've been on the internet constantly since COVID. But that's not because I need to use the internet for psychological or emotional reasons or impulse control reasons. It's because under COVID, that's the only way I can get my lectures out to y'all. So we want to separate circumstances where work or academics require that level of internet engagement. So I'm going to stop there on this video because that's a lot to process. And I will be back with what do the experts think? What do the experts think?